So we ended our session prematurely, but um, before we hung up, I was talking about the different database. Now it looks like I'm not going to do the coding yet because when I do the coding, uh, we fall short. So allow me to first get to the very beginning, the very beginning, when we move together. I said PHP is a hypertext preprocessor and it's a server-side scripting language that can be embedded into HTML or just as a standalone backend. And I mentioned that you can have PHP um, as a separate file, the PHP in the back end, and then you can have it within your own HTML. We've been looking at HTML, Bootstrap, JavaScript, and we shall be looking at jQuery in front end, but all that was front end and front end. We still need to look at back end business logic. We need to look at models that communicate with databases. We need to look at APIs and so on and so forth. But as we look at those things, we should learn that PHP will be appearing uh, sometimes in the front end or separate in the back end to do the entire back end stuff. And the language, server side means something that runs on the server, that is back end. Whereas client side is anything that runs on your phone, which is the front, and that is front end. We have two things that are a little bit similar, as I said in the previous session, that got broken. You can choose to echo and print something in JavaScript. The difference between the two is that echo works in the browser, whereas print would work in the terminal, in the console, etc. I also mentioned that you can embed PHP directly in HTML by creating, um, PHP always starts with the question mark and opening tab of PHP. So if you save your file as a .php file, and then you open the tag like this paragraph saying current time, and then you open this tag and then call this in this manner, and in between you added any PHP function, then that function will work in principle. So this would output the exact current time date time. And I talked about variables in PHP where I said use the dollar mark to start a variable name in PHP. So you always recommend it just like in other object programming languages to start your variable name with a lowercase letter, and in case there is a second name in an uppercase. So that app name would be small letters in app, then capital N A M A M E A M E. And I was mentioning that in PHP we have strings, we have booleans, we have uh, integers, we have floating point numbers, we have the null value, and PHP is loosely typed by default, and we use declare for strict mode, so you can get to declare something at the very top of the file. And then I mentioned that soon we shall be having things like include, require, just to uh, protect a certain file from being logged in. These are added at the very top of the PHP file that we like to lock. Talking of different data types in object-oriented PHP, especially 8.2, you must declare the data type of anything you are doing. For example, we can say string, we can say integer, and then we can say float, we can say boolean, string, null, and array. We shall continue having functions in PHP when we get to the level of functions, whereby we get to declare a function and then we mention the type of data that is the resultant of that very function, especially when we get more into the business logic. Most of the things that we're going to do in PHP include creating model files, creating controllers, and the entire business logic is controllers, and then something called middleware. Middleware communicates with the front end to ensure that data is relayed in a proper format. The controller sorts the entire business logic, and then the model file serves it to the database. The controller will bring whatever is from the model file as an API. And we shall look at the different APIs like the REST API. We shall look at Ajax or Ajax, etc. Now you can do what we call typecasting in PHP. If we have a variable that is called goals and we say it's equivalent to 5 goals, that's one way of writing that. Then we can have another one called number that declares that this should be an integer of the previous variable called 5 goals, which is the goals variable. This will output 5 and casts the string to integer and takes the leading number. So we had a string that was saying 5 goals. But when we have another variable that says the integer of whatever was in the previous variable that was a string, it would typecast out that. In fact, if we say float goals as a variable, then it should define this as a floating point number 5.0. If we said string is a string 42 and we try to print that or echo that, it will give us 42 in quotation marks because we want it as a string. If we say the boolean and then we gave it an empty, then it will give us a false. It would force whatever we've given unto it into the value of the primitive data type that you've attributed to it. If we said boolean and then into brackets we would into quotation marks false, it would know that now this is a true string and to give it true because it's a non-empty string. Yet with an empty, even if we added um, nothing there, then it will be already false. So that's what we call typecasting. Typecasting is used when we want to furthermore manipulate a specific variable or data type in a more meaningful way to us as the program. We've talked about if we had a variable called goals and we defined it as a string called 5 goals, and then we called another variable called number and we said it's an integer of goals, it would extract 5 out of that string. Whereas if we declared float of the same very if we declared float of the same very variable goals, then it would pull out the 5 and then convert it into a floating point number. Yet if we had a variable called string and then we declare a string and we gave it an integer value to give us to give it to us as a string. If you gave it a string and then you say 42.11, it would still print out the string quotation marks 42.11. If you had a boolean and then you gave it an empty string, then it should print you a false because that string is empty. Whereas if you have a boolean and then you give it a string with anything inside it, then it's true. So talking of something that I've just mentioned earlier is in PHP we have constants. When you say define, remember in JavaScript we had let, we had const, and then we had var. But here we have define. When you have define and you give it two parameters, app name and scope, in runtime this will always be a constant at PHP runtime. If you had something similar that is very popular is when we are trying to do PDO, which is um, which we use to communicate with our databases. Remember, we can use MySQLi, we can use PDO, but PDO is the most popular one, especially for object-oriented programming languages. We can define the DB host and then the local host, and if these are in the .m file and we have a configuration file for this, it will be a constant that that is the database being route. Whereas we can also use const just like in JavaScript where we have a constant called maximum count GB 500. Now this at the compile time will also be a constant and can be used inside of classes. So it's constant and can be used in classes. If we say echo app name and then we do not use the dollar sign for this specific constant, then this will not be considered as a variable. It will be considered as a constant. We often use this because constants are meant to remain constant, just like the name literally means. We don't expect you to add variable names to constants at any singular point. At any singular point. Moving forward, when we also have string operators in PHP. Many would think that in PHP, operands or operations are only works with numbers. But assuming we had a variable called t, and t was a string to Uganda cranes, if you wanted to add the team to any greeting and probably you're trying to come up with a message to send automatically on email or WhatsApp using PHP, you would say greeting equals to welcome to, and then you add a dollar sign to, it would feed the variable Uganda cranes into its coverage. So this would output welcome to the Uganda cranes coverage. So this is called variable interpolation. It's called variable interpolation. We get a variable team, we get any variable that is a string, and then within quotation marks of another string, the moment we add a dollar sign into them, it interpoles into it and sits. But there is also another way. We can say greeting could be welcome to, and then we put team under curl brackets. Curl brackets is a brace syntax and it's more explicit. So that would also give us reference, but in a more explicit way. But we can also do concatenation, and we don't need interpolation, where we get to concatenate together friends right outside of everything of these so-called quotation marks. Now, I read that when we started, I don't know whether it's you or someone else, you told me that you knew the difference between a single mark, a single quotation mark, and a double quotation mark. In case you're using a single quotation mark, then you would have say welcome to, then you put a dot, which means bind this with, just like in JavaScript, then a dollar sign for a variable of another string, and then you concatenate it with an exclamation mark. This would print welcome to the Uganda cranes. These are the three major ways in which we use operands with strings to add them to maybe some other things that we might need. Alright, there is something different that is called a multi-line string interpolation. What I've been talking about earlier is a single line, something more like welcome Barack when someone visits their dashboard. But in here, Doc, we more looking at multiple lines in which we can add a string within an HTML document. We can declare a variable which is called HTML, and we say HTML gives us uh, a triple EOT, and then we write some lines of code, and then within these lines of code, you can see that. Just a minute. Okay, welcome, Nassim. Uh, in today's class, I'm not doing lots of practical because uh, the moment I open my text editor, this laptop will shut down. This laptop is not the one that I always use. I always use this laptop remotely. on a better laptop. That's why it's running on Linux. So I was talking about, by the time you kicked in, I was talking about the different operators, but I have no issue scrolling all the way to around here. One, I said that PHP is a server-side programming language, which means I've moved a little bit back so that you can catch up with me. I was saying PHP is a scripting language because it works on the server side. And then I mentioned that over time we've been doing a lot of front end HTML, CSS, JavaScript, which is front end logic, and then soon we're going to also see jQuery. However, JavaScript, PHP works in a way that we can embed it within HTML by making that HTML document a PHP document, or we can make it completely a standalone server-side code. It gives us sort of a way that the server gets to create business logic. And I say that business logic in programming is what we call controllers. They get to control everything from the back. I've mentioned that APIs are built in the controller and they listen to the database with what we call model files. Models, their only work is to interact with our database, whether with MySQL or PostgreSQL. The work of model files, which are also PHP, is just put that PDO communication so that things are saved into the database and are retrieved out of the database when they are needed. But when you're creating APIs that we shall learn in later classes, we are basically, in principle, trying to create ways in which we create JSON files that can be set to HTML and then embedded, or just creating variables that we can push directly into the HTML. I started by mentioning two different things that are often misinterchanged. One is echo and another one is print. When I say echo works when you want to output something in a browser and it's popular because PHP was ideally created for web development, ideally. But print can work in your terminal when you're trying to find some logic within your PHP. It can work in the console, etc. And it's a little bit more faster. So, when you're embedding your PHP directly into your HTML, there are two ways. You can choose to start a PHP tag. PHP tags always start with the opening tag and the question mark, and then they close with the question mark and the closing tag. Then in between, you get to declare anything that is a PHP function or inbuilt function, and it will always work. Or you can declare a variable. Now, to understand variables, I said variables always begin with the dollar mark. And when you're writing them, it's, it's proper syntax to always start with a small letter. And if it has a second word, like you see this very one, app name and average goals and match count is live, the second letter should always be capital. This is the same thing that we do in many other object-oriented programming languages like you see Java. Then I spoke about the different data types we have in PHP. We have strings, of course. We have floating point numbers. We have integers. We have these are integers. We have booleans. We have the null value, and PHP can be loosely typed by default by declaring something at the very top of that file, as we are about to see. So that is also another way of writing things, your variables. But in object-oriented programming languages, and especially in the latest versions like 8.2 that we are working on, we get to define the exact data type we want a specific function to give us. For example, we can say that string such and such, and if that function has been placed to string, even if the output is a numeral, as you are about to see, even if it's an integer, it will always put it in double quotation marks to give you a string value. We get to define int by saying int and then the value. We get to define float by saying float and the value, boolean, the same thing, null and arrays. We shall look at arrays where we have associative arrays and dimensional arrays as we proceed with this course. Apart from that, I talked about typecasting. PHP is so funny that you don't need to be rigid from switching from one data type to another. For example, if we had a variable that is called goals, and this variable gave us this string that is 5 goals. 5 goals in this at this juncture is a string. However, despite the function assuming that this is a string, inside of this string we have an integer. Inside of this string, there is an integer. So if you want to extract that integer out of that string, you can define another variable like number, and then you say int, like we said earlier here, and we say goals. Int goals. This will say that go into the goals variable and pick out the integer in it, and it will output for you an integer in it which is 5. So it casts this integer out of the string. However, if there is no integer inside of that string, then it should bring an error. I want us to move through these rules very carefully before we go into coding. And it's a very good opportunity that today the IDE has going to run. We have, furthermore, we can do the same thing for float. If there is a number inside of the string, then you can just say float and that variable, and that